Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The Taliban's refusal to take part in a fourth round of talks with the United States in Doha this week has thrown a spanner in the Afghan peace process. This comes as the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Reconciliation is back in the region for talks with influential players. The Taliban's rejection of direct talks with the Afghan government is a major stumbling block to any Afghan-led process. To discuss that and a lot more, we're joined here in our studios by our esteemed guests. We have Mr. Rupert Stone, who is a political analyst, and he's originally from Berlin in Germany. He's based there. He's an independent journalist who works on national security and counterterrorism. Thanks for coming in, Rupert. And we're also joined by Dr. Monis Ahmed, who is an international relations expert. He's Meritorious Professor of International Relations at the University of Karachi, and he's in town in Lahore and has come into our studios as well. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ahmed. So I'd like to start, if I may, with you, Rupert. We have the Taliban refusing to take part in these talks in Qatar, saying that they do not want to talk to the Afghan government because the Afghan government was supposed to have a representative on the ground for these talks. What do you make of that?
On one level, it's not surprising because the Taliban's been very averse to talking to the Afghan government. And it's quite early, I think, in the current peace process for that stage of the talks to occur.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the most complex stage of the negotiations of the Afghan on Afghan. It'll have to happen at some point, but I think this is a bit premature. So, although on one level it's concerning because they have to talk to each other, on another it's not surprising.
Yeah.
And even kind of understandable because there are still issues to resolve with the United States.
And Monis, what do you make of that? Because many people would say, listen, the Taliban have a point here. The actual major player is the United States. And as the Taliban says, the Kabul government is a puppet.
It reminds me when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. And when the Geneva talks commenced, 1982, the Pakistan government refused to talk to the Kabul regime, calling that regime as a puppet government, puppet of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they were lured into. So the Geneva talks were indirect in nature, meaning there were no direct talks between the Pakistan side and the Afghan side. But when the Geneva Accords were signed on the 14th of April, 1988, so the ceremony included the Afghan government, the Pakistan government, United States, the Soviet Union, the UN. So basically, the Afghan Taliban, they argue, they are right to some extent.
Yeah.
But they have to be realistic to the fact that who is in control in Kabul, who is in control in some of the Afghan territories. So the Kabul regime has a role. The Taliban, they basically demand that 25,000 of the prisoners must be released.
Yeah.
They have pulled out, or they temporarily, I mean, they are not going for talks with the US earlier in Saudi Arabia, then in Qatar. They are complaining that Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they are pressurizing the Taliban to talk to the Afghan government, which they don't want to.
Yeah.
So that is the stalemate. But I'm sure that the Taliban will have to.
Yeah.
Will have to agree as far as a tripartite type of United States, the Taliban, and the Afghan government.
Right. So Rupert, I'm wondering why this push now for peace talks? Is it all down to the Trump administration, do you think, and Trump wanting to, as he had said as candidate, to lessen interventions, if I may use that word, around the world? Obviously, I'm paraphrasing him. Is it all down to that, or do you think the U.S. is just, we know that the figure is about $1 trillion has been spent in Afghanistan. Many of the goals, or most of the goals, have not been achieved in the United States. Do you think it's all just down to the wariness of the United States to continue this?
I think partly that, but partly there's been a realization by the US and the Afghan government that this conflict can't be resolved militarily for several years, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, even quite early in the conflict, the US and Afghan government were trying to, at the very least, reintegrate members of the Taliban who defected. And then eventually that changed into reconciling with the movement as a whole. And that goes back really quite a long way. And then the Obama administration conducted secret talks with the Taliban in 2011. And those efforts broke down.
Yeah.
But my point is that it isn't the first time the US has decided to do this.
Right.
It's given added impetus now, I think firstly because Trump clearly wants to end this war.
Yeah.
And given his temperament, it's entirely possible he'll just snap his fingers and pull out
Walk away.
by tweet or whatever.
Yeah.
So his advisors are obviously scared into doing something concrete and thorough. And that's why we're seeing this very fast, and I suspect overly fast, attempt to conduct talks.
Okay. Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from Peshawar, and he is a Pakistani journalist, of course, and political and security analyst, and of course, an expert in Afghanistan who we've had on often on this show. Mr. Rahimullah, thanks for joining us here in the scope. What do you make of the Taliban refusal to meet with the United States and, of course, the Afghan government officials in Qatar?
The Taliban had announced that this meeting is going to be held in Qatar on the 9th and 10th of January. And now they have said that this meeting will not take place. So there seems to be some issue concerning the Taliban and the U.S. And another, I think, reason is that Zalmay Khalilzad has gone on a visit of 4 countries. So he won't be available until the end of this month.
Right.
I believe that these talks will continue. There are hurdles, there are issues which are unresolved, but I think they have not given up. Both sides are willing to engage and to continue talking. So there is still hope that these talks will go ahead, although they may not be able to achieve a breakthrough until, the Taliban agree to talk to the Afghan government.
Exactly. And on that point, Mr. Rahimullah, I wanted to pick up on the Afghan government factor, as you just mentioned. Do you think, Mr. Rahimullah, that the Afghan government feels sort of left out at this point in time? Because we also have Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah coming out very strongly, in fact, against any proposals of an interim government, saying that that must not occur, that Afghans must accept the current administration.
For now, yes, we can say that the Afghan government has been left out, but I think this is not going to, be like this for long, because eventually there will be talks. There has to be talks between Taliban and the Afghan government, because the issue right now, according to Taliban, is a decision, an agreement on the withdrawal of foreign forces. That has been their first and foremost demand. So they want to resolve that first. If they get a commitment about the withdrawal, even if it's not, say, quick, because earlier I remember they used to say that we want immediate withdrawal of all foreign forces. Now I think they're willing. They're a bit flexible regarding a timetable of withdrawal. And, that, I think, issue needs to be put out of the way. The Americans, cannot do this without consulting the Afghan government and taking them along. So the Americans would like the Afghan government to have a seat at the table where this issue can be discussed and maybe resolved. So there are, all these hitches, and this is not going to be the first time that talks will be postponed. I think this will happen frequently as they go along.
Mr. Rahimullah, because I know you have to go, so let me just ask you a final question before we say goodbye to you. What do you make, Mr. Rahimullah, then of, when we move forward, Afghan security? Because there are many questions, aren't there, about whether the Afghans can actually keep their own country secure, can secure their air, can secure their borders, can secure land, because we know the Taliban are actually, according to many estimates, are actually growing in power.
The Afghan government, we all know, is weak and vulnerable, and that's why they require, international assistance. There are still these foreign forces in Afghanistan. The air support provided by the U.S.-led forces is critical. And, the money given by the U.S. and its allies, more than $5 billion a year. That is keeping the Afghan security forces in shape. So that these are all, issues which are very important for the Afghan government. Afghan government on its own, I think, will not be able to keep the country secure or sustain the government in power. So I think Taliban know that. Ashraf Ghani knows that. He has said on record that his army may collapse if there is no international assistance for 6 months. The U.S. Military commanders, the U.S. Experts, analysts, they all agree that this government may not stay in power if there is no outside support. Okay. So I think these are the reasons why the issue of the withdrawal of foreign forces is so critical to the whole thing.
Right.
This cannot just be decided, by accepting the Taliban demand.
Indeed.
But I also know that it won't be easy for Taliban to retain control of any city which they may capture. It has happened in the past. Kunduz, Ghazni, we all know that. Kunduz twice was captured by Taliban. So Taliban cannot commit so many troops to keep control of a city if they capture it, or to keep control of the highways or the borders. So Taliban also have limitations.
All right, on that point then, Mr. Rahimullah, we'll leave it there with you, but of course we appreciate your time. We're just going to go into a very short break, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be right back with our esteemed guests in the studio, and we're going to add another voice, if we can, on the phone. Thanks for staying with us, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our conversation about the entire Afghan peace process and the Taliban walking away from this specific fourth round of talks that were to be held in Qatar. Let's continue that discussion before adding another voice to this conversation. Rupert, I wanted to go to you and ask you about, before the break, we were talking to Mr. Rahimullah, and he mentioned the fact that this is not the first time around that peace has been tried with the Taliban and other relevant such groups. Is there more of a chance now, or does this, again, at least from the outside, it seems like a very rushed process almost right now?
It could be seen that way, yeah. I mean, it's only just starting, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But I'm sorry, what was your question again?
I mean, do you think this is a rushed process, or do you think that there is actually a chance here for actual peace with the Taliban?
Well, I think there are some positive factors. I mean, the first thing is that the regional neighboring countries are all getting more involved.
Yeah.
And they're doing that partly because they're worried about Islamic State in Afghanistan and the security threat that might pose to them. China's a very good example, which has long had fears about Uyghur terrorists attacking China, using Afghanistan as a base. So that's one reason these countries are concerned.
Yeah.
And more recently, they're becoming concerned because they have growing economic interests in Afghanistan. A classic example of that is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
China has other economic projects, housing projects in Afghanistan, and its economic investments have been rising there. And there are other examples of that. For example, Iran has strong economic interests, especially in Western Afghanistan.
Yeah, and security interests.
And security interests, especially relating to Islamic State.
Yeah.
So these factors mean that there's more of a involvement from regional powers, which is very important. However, that presents complications because all these countries are going to have to be involved in the peace process, and getting all these huge, powerful countries to agree on a settlement is not going to be straightforward. I mean, how do you get Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are both involved in this process, to agree? How do Pakistan and India? That's not going to be straightforward.
Yeah.
So it's a massive task that lies ahead.
Yeah. So I wonder what you make of that then, Munis, because with all these players in Afghanistan, one wonders, though, at the same time, in 2001, when the U.S. went in, again, it gave a very rosy picture of what would occur. And we had George W. Bush making very grand statements even at that time about defeating the Taliban, etc. All these years later, the Taliban still are quite strong. And, according to reports, as I had put to Mr. Rahimullah as well, their power may be growing in some estimates. What's gone wrong? Why weren't these regional countries involved before? Why weren't this peace talks process, being held with as much fervor at that time?
Well, what went wrong? Many things.
Okay.
The first, primarily, that the Afghans themselves, the stakeholders, the local stakeholders, they themselves didn't realize that they have to first put their house in order.
Okay.
Talk about democracy. Was Afghanistan ever a democracy? Talk about good governance. The challenge, the second thing about the rebuilding of Afghanistan, and a lot of money the money poured into Afghanistan. Where that money has gone, Afghanistan is as impoverished as it was. It is as dependent as it was. So the Afghans, I think, whether the Afghans are from the Northern Alliance, the so-called Northern Alliance, or you have the Pashtun elite, the former Pashtun elite, or the Taliban, where is Afghan nationalism? Who are the Afghans? There's no ownership.
But then, to be fair, Monis, wouldn't people argue this is actually the U.S. should be shouldering the blame for this, or NATO, because they're the ones who came in, right?
No,
and
who
invaded their
provided,
country.
no, NATO and the US ISAF, International Security Assistance Force, that why Afghanistan was allowed by the Taliban
Yeah.
as a hub of terrorism, the Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, books have been written on that how Al-Qaeda used to operate from Afghanistan. I'm not saying that the United States has a legitimate right. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But the thing is, basically, historically speaking, the Afghans themselves have invited foreign invasions, interventions. Look at the Anglo-Afghan wars. Look at Afghanistan is the only country in the world which has experienced foreign intervention and occupation by the three major parts: British, Soviet, and American. And that is what is their problem. They are not able to put their country, hold their country. And the Taliban, I mean, what is the guarantee? That if they come to power, they have said that we'll do it again. Cleverly, the spokesman of Taliban is saying that no, we'll be a bit flexible, but we know them very well. Their mindset has not changed. So what will happen? The United States, I think Donald Trump, the American president, yesterday called the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and talked about, because India is a player.
Yes.
Is a big player in Afghanistan, and in India there are concerns that in case of the foreign military withdrawal from Afghanistan, that country will again plunge into what it was after the Soviet withdrawal.
Yeah.
And Pakistan will face a double jeopardy.
Of course.
Double jeopardy, because if the American forces or the foreign forces remain in Afghanistan, there will continue to be suicide attacks and the Taliban and all that. If American foreign forces they withdraw from Afghanistan, there will be the likelihood of a civil war. So
Okay,
is Pakistan prepared? Yeah. Can the porous border, can the fencing of border, Pak-Afghan border, prevent the fresh influx of Afghan refugees? I don't think so.
All very, very good points. I wanted to add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mirwais Khan, who is international affairs analyst, and he's joining us from Islamabad. He is a journalist and writer who has covered Afghan affairs for a significant amount of time now. Mirwais, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. What do you make, Mirwais, about that point that Munis there was making about the Taliban themselves? Can they really be trusted going forward? Because that's a question that even Khalilzad, in fact, has brought up, saying that, the Taliban really need to prove that they're in this process and can be trusted moving forward if any agreement were to be made.
First of all, thanks for calling me here for this hot issue for today. My question is here, can American be trusted, not the Taliban? We should start with America. The agenda was clear before, when the peace talk began again. The agenda was clear that first they will have negotiation with Taliban directly. Once they move to the final stage, and after that, after moving the foreign troops from Afghanistan, then they will engage with the Afghan government. So it was clear at the first moment. Now I don't understand the strategy of America, other countries, that how can they say bring those things which were avoided before? It was clear message from Taliban before starting this peace talk that until and unless we got to come to a conclusion, we will not sit with Afghan government. So now bringing such things in the middle of peace talk, it clearly shows that America doesn't want what they are showing or selling in market.
We go to you, Rupert, and that point that Mir raised there was making again about the United States, and I'm gonna refer back to a New York Times report which I was reading today as I was doing research for the show. CIA has led units just recently in Nangarhar and host provinces, and according to the New York Times, it said those units have been unconstrained by battlefield rules designed to protect civilians. They've conducted night raids, torture, and killings with near impunity in a covert campaign. And this is the New York Times directly. Do you think that all of that has created the perfect storm? In fact, when I asked about the Taliban and its strength seemingly growing in some areas, it can be argued. Do you think that's why the Taliban is being able to recruit more people towards its side versus the Afghan government side?
Because of these sorts of abuses?
Yes, abuses by the United States, because it seems like they're pushing them into the arms of the Taliban armies. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the human rights groups who've reported on these abuses have said that these sorts of activities alienate the local population and drive them into the hands of the Taliban.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are other factors doing that too, but certainly that's one reason not to torture people and engage in these sorts of crimes, which is what they are, if they're true. So yes, in essence.
And what do you make of that? Do you agree?
I think it makes sense. I agree with him. But the thing is basically that Afghanistan or the Afghans are facing a devil in a deep blue sea situation. Because of the simple fact that if the American forces in Afghanistan, the coalition forces in Afghanistan, the last 17 years, the Bagram air base, like the Abu Ghraib jail and the Guantanamo Bay, totally, inhuman, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. But then the thing is basically that in the last 17, 18 years, if we compare as far the Vietnam war, why the Taliban, they have not been able, unlike the Soviet Union, when regardless of the ethnic and or sectarian, cleavages among the Afghans, all of them were against the Soviets and the PDPA regime against the PDPA regime. Why we see the insurgency or why we see the conflict in Afghanistan, armed conflict in Afghanistan, only involving a segment of the Pashtun population, which was not the Ahmad Shah Massoud was a Tajik, right? Dostam, he was an Uzbek, and others. Burhanuddin Rabbani, he was not a Pashtun. So they were all against the Soviet Union because that was basically the right and the left. But in case of Afghanistan, the thing is basically that the insurgency is primarily by a segment of the Pashtun who happen to be Taliban, and not all the Pashtuns support Taliban because they know very well that what was their mode of governance when they were in power. And I will not be surprised that the moment, and who are the Taliban? I mean, who are their, what their philosophy? What about, are they capable enough of again administering Afghanistan? It's a very difficult country. So I can see the balkanization of Afghanistan.
In Amir Rice, Munasir made a very good point, didn't he? Because can the Taliban really actually govern Afghanistan? And would Afghans even accept the Taliban in any form of power in their country, do you think?
Sir, first of all, I will have to answer some of the points which he mentioned. Taliban is not only Pashtun leading a group or some movements. There are Hazara Taliban, there are Uzbek Taliban, so now they are even Tajik Taliban. So for my brother who is sitting there, I just want to clarify that it's not clear that only Pashtuns are involved in Taliban movements. There are differences because I've been in southern region. I was reporting from southern region Kandahar from 2010 onward till 2017, 18. So I know the basic backgrounds. There are Tajik Taliban, there are Uzbek Taliban, there are Hazara Taliban. In 2015, again the peace talk started. Again something act from America. And now again in 2018, peace talk started. Now in the middle, they brought out something else, some a condition which was clarified before starting it. So it clearly shows that the America doesn't want a peace talk over here because they are playing game over here. And to one side, they have started a peace talk. And on another side, they killed Mullah Manan a month or 2 months ago.
But to be fair,
Who
Mir
was a
Weiss,
very
Mir Weiss, if I may come in here, I imagine the Americans would argue, why would we go through all this trouble to even beginning peace talks? This is not really all worth it, is it? Because Khalilzad is in the region again now. He's seemingly, at least on the outside, putting a lot of effort into this.
No. This was a tactic to put a pressure on Pakistan, nothing else. There was nothing else in that because they were saying Taliban are moving from Pakistan and they want this thing. And that's the reason they were putting pressure on Pakistan to bring them in, because this is the fourth time Pakistan is doing it and the American is destroying it. So now the Taliban have no trust in Pakistan. That's the reason they are putting pressure. So there was no issue of Taliban and Afghanistan. This was straight issues directly to Pakistan. They were putting a pressure on Pakistan, but which the Pakistan leader have taken very good care of that, and they are dealing very good. But I don't think so that they are putting any pressure, any interest in peace talk. They are just playing games.
Okay, Mir Weiss, let me put the points that you just made there, Mir Weiss, to our studio guests. So, Rupert, what do you make of that? Do you think that the Americans are just playing a game here?
No. No, I think there is clearly an effort to get out of Afghanistan on the part of President Trump.
Okay.
There's, to be fair to your guest, there's clearly pushback from this inside the US government. One example is a recent story which showed that some of Trump's advisors have persuaded him to reduce the planned troop withdrawal that he desired by about half, which would amount to just reducing the number of forces he'd actually inserted in the conflict in 2017.
Right.
So that's one example of the tensions within the Trump administration. So it's, I mean, I think there's clearly a serious effort being made to come to some kind of agreement.
Yeah.
Whether the US is actually going to pull out of Afghanistan entirely is, even if there's an agreement, is up for debate.
Because the argument is made, Rupert, that the US doesn't really ever pull out from wherever it goes into militarily, especially in contemporary history. If we look at US interventions anywhere in the world, it doesn't really walk away militarily, does it? I mean, it leaves something behind of great significance wherever it goes, doesn't it?
Yeah, and in the case of Afghanistan, there was a leaked peace plan recently, which was, I think, produced by the RAND Corporation.
Yes.
And the US government has stated that it doesn't represent US policy, but still it's interesting. Yeah. And one of the items in that is that even after the US pull out, there would be a residual small counterterrorism force, a NATO-led counterterrorism force. And that's one example of how there would still be some kind of US footprint. The second point I think that's important is, and this was made also by Munis in some form, is that the Afghan economy is so dependent on foreign aid and drugs as well, and really isn't self-sufficient. Yeah. So the US the Taliban probably don't want the US to pull out all its funding entirely. And there have been rumors and reports that they might be prepared to accept some continuing foreign aid commitment and even some kind of security assistance as well in the long term.
Okay, Munis, I'm sure you had a response, but unfortunately the clock has gotten the best of us. We will have to continue this conversation at a later time, but I appreciate, of course, both of you coming into our studios. That was Dr. Munis Ahmer, Meritorious Professor of International Relations at the University of Karachi. And of course, we had Rupert Stone, based in Berlin, Germany. He's an independent journalist. He's working on national security and counterterrorism. We also had Mir Weiss Khan, international affairs analyst, speaking to us from Islamabad. And earlier we had Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, political analyst, speaking to us from Peshawar. Now, viewers, before I conclude this segment, I think it's important to mention, as all of our guests have, that there are many facets to this issue of any prospects of Afghan peace in the future or near term or long term. And of course, there are many interests, there are many hands in this pie, as they say, a lot of external powers who play a role in Afghanistan as well. All of that will need to be balanced out, won't it? Especially the U.S. role, NATO role, and the regional countries' roles as well. We'll obviously wait and see how all of this plays out vis-a-vis the Afghan peace process. We'll keep a very close eye on that here in The Scope. But thanks for watching. We'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're still in The Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Yellow Vest protests in France that continue into a ninth weekend as President Macron's attempts to placate the movement have not yet borne fruit. The Prime Minister has added fuel to the fire by saying unauthorized demonstrations will be banned, as will known agitators. Promised national debates that Yellow Vests have dismissed outright for their limited scope are also on the horizon. To discuss that further, we're now joined firstly by Van Megarduchian, who is a political commentator, and he's joining us from the French capital, Paris. Van, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Van, tell us a bit about what your thoughts are regarding the latest when it comes to Yellow Vests. We now have essentially the protests to be sanctioned, specifically, of course, unauthorized protests.
Look, I think what is going on is a little bit of a short-sighted kind of solution proposed by the government, especially by the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. Listen, today in today's world, it is rare for us in a democratic, free country, especially in the developed world, to see rules that would limit, that would sanction protests that are not clear, that are not authorized prior the protest or prior the movement, the demonstration. People every day, people demonstrate in front of the White House every day. In most countries, people gather in squares and public spaces to demonstrate. Sanctioning a protest in this way, I think, in my opinion, was a little bit short-sighted. But there is another element to it, which is the Prime Minister spoke about this, sanctioning it, and especially building a database to basically name and enlist, register the names of all those people who are like in hundreds of people now who have been briefly arrested or arrested for a day or two. These people will have their names registered in a database. That is a little bit worrying to many in France today, because of it reminds them of other databases that are used to categorize radical terrorists or violent people. So basically, putting all these protesters who might have engaged in sort of a violence with the police or the riot police is a little bit worrying. Apart from that, it looks like there is an attempt to push this confrontation in France today, from having it between the protesters, the angry protesters and the president, to a movement that is basically the street versus the cops, the street versus the police, the street versus the order in the country.
Okay, so I'm wondering at this point what you make, Van, of the support for the Yellow Vest movement still in France. I was reading a poll today that says that the support for the Yellow Vest has dropped 10% since before Christmas to 60%.
Although I'm not a big fan of, but the latest polls, as you mentioned, the latest polls are talking about a country which is divided, as it was divided as 2 months ago when it started. First, the country is still divided. You see polls that talk about 50% to 60% support for the Yellow Vests. You see other polls saying you have 50 to 60% of people who would wish this movement to stop, who would wish that people go back to dialogue and get off the streets, etc., etc. But these polls, they tend to, we tend to go and ask people a certain question which would merit a certain specific answer. If you ask someone on the street whether you would like this protest, which is very violent and that it's causing a lot of damage on the streets, or leaving people wounded, or there are fights, and if you describe the protest in asking a question, if you describe this protest as something violent, which is what many in the government are describing, then of course somebody will answer you, look, listen, I'm not for a violent protest, so I'm So if you ask another question, the polls would give you another understanding. The polls would show you that most people support what the yellow vests are demanding. Most people want to see an improvement in their salaries, like any other place in the world. Most people would like to see that their purchasing power improve. Most people would like to see, a new kind of an understanding, a new kind of trust between the state and the people. There is not only mistrust between the government and the people today. There is a mistrust in the system, which is impacting politics.
And talking about the system, if I may, Van, because I think it's important to bring up here this proposal by the Yellow Vest for people to withdraw all their money from banks across France. It's according to some reports, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Again, this goes back to a poll, but according to some reports, they say 70% of the population is willing to withdraw their money from banks, and obviously that would create chaos for France's banking system. What do you make of that?
They have enough money to withdraw from the banks than they would probably do. I don't know if people have enough savings anymore. That there is the problem. The French people were used to having savings, but what the problem is today is most of the people who are especially supporting this movement, or who are directly or indirectly impacted by what we're discussing, most of these people cannot really finish their month without with some money. They usually they end up getting to the middle of the month and they got nothing left from their salaries anymore. And this is the issue. They see that there is an inflation throughout the country, especially in France, in economic terms, in the market. This inflation has not, their salaries have not been, up to date with this inflation. Their salaries have not been, they haven't had a proper raise. Their salaries are not, adequate for such a living standard that has become very expensive in France and, as a matter of fact, throughout the world.
All right, so that was Van Megadouchian speaking to us from Paris. He was a political commentator. Van, we appreciate the insight and analysis that you brought to our discussion. We're going to add another voice now. We're joined now by Dr. Emily Santini, who is a political expert, and she's joining us from Stirling in Scotland. She's a lecturer in politics at the University of Stirling. Emily, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Now, Emily, obviously there are a lot of things that can talk about when it comes to the Yellow Vest, but the major thing that stands out seems to be this national debate, which has been promised by Macron to start soon. We had, the official who was heading that national debate, or was supposed to head that national debate. She's resigned because her salary was an exorbitant 14,700 euros a month. Do you think all of that proves what the Yellow Vest protesters' point is, that Macron really is a president of the rich?
I certainly don't think it helps. But I don't think this is something that's new under Macron. The fact is that we're starting to have a conversation about the way in which individuals in upper management positions, especially in the public sector, are receiving salaries that are completely disproportionate compared to the median workers' wages. This information has always been public domain. I think it's something that crops up every so often. I think it certainly didn't help in the context of a debate where what we're trying to do is bring closer a president not known for being warm and approachable, and trying to reconnect with citizens I certainly don't think that helped.
Right. So, and what do you make of the debates themselves and the entire initiative? Because the Yellow Vesters have essentially dismissed these debates outright, saying that they're only going to be limited to four main themes, as I'm sure you well know: green transition, citizenship, tax, and state organization. Macron's reforms will not even really be questioned during these debates. Will this, do you think, placate the people?
I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting from the perspective of the government. I think this is something that they are not terribly comfortable with, and watching them test new ground with this participatory democratic initiative in which they're going to have to relinquish a lot of control, and yet watching them try to micromanage this in such a short amount of time is throwing up lots of interesting questions. And you're seeing lots of contradictions and changes in position, changes in the different things that even ministers and MPs are saying about what can and cannot be considered, what can and cannot be raised on the table, what is and isn't up for debate. It's been very interesting to see how this democratic initiative, which we would normally associate with sort of being very far left field from Macron and his team, is being organized. Now, the question of who will participate, I think, is only just coming up, because you're right. The question is, if this is being organized to deal with the grievances of the Gilets jaunes, and the Gilets jaunes, by and large, are not pledging to attend or to support this initiative, they prefer a type of initiative that's a sort of citizens referendum instead, then who is going to be participating? Is it going to be other types of lobbies and groups that might end up superseding the debate, colonizing these discussions in order to further their agenda? There has been some concern about whether this could be used, for example, to roll back some social rights concerning equal marriage or the right to abortion or even the death penalty.
Right. So let me add another voice to this conversation. Now joined as well by Mr. Alexander Seal, who is a journalist, and he's joining us from London. He's a freelance journalist who's also an expert in French politics. Alexander, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Alexander, we're discussing this prospects of these national debates, 3 months of national debates we're supposed to have in France. Do you think that will work in the country towards appeasing those people who have genuine grievances?
I'm not sure if a national debate will work, but I think that Emmanuel Macron should speak to lots of mayors in France and speak to maybe some leaders of Yellow Vests, because some politicians from Les Républicains, the conservatives, and from the socialists have said that Emmanuel Macron should speak to the people. He should speak to maybe mayors of France, because the mayors, the local authorities, are the people who are in contact with people in daily life, basically.
But then, to be fair, Alexander, Macron would say, listen, I'm trying. And Macron has said himself that he would also take part in at least one of these national debates. Should we not give him credit for that?
Well, as you know, that Emmanuel Macron was elected in May 2017. He promised to reunite France because it's a divided country. But and in his New Year's Eve wishes, in his message in 2018, so last year basically, he promised social cohesion, and that didn't really work. And so this year he was very affirmative, and he said we'll pursue the reforms. And so, one can't really reform a country in 5 minutes, basically. He needs time, and he understands people's anger, and he's trying to do his best. The Gilets jaunes, these yellow vests, have been criticizing Emmanuel Macron because he's been saying silence, but I think he's doing his best, I think.
Okay, so Emily, I'm wondering what you make of the rhetoric and the violence that we've seen play out here. when it comes to this yellow vest issue and their grievances. Because, on one side, we have a former French education minister, as you well know, Luc Ferry, who has said that, we have the fourth largest army in the world and we should put an end to this, pardon my language, this crap, as he said. Those are quotations that are exact. He said, but then he at the same time admitted, Emily, that this movement, according to him, has attracted the support of 80% of French. That's very harsh rhetoric, essentially. The shoot-to-kill policy, essentially, is what he is advocating for. What do you make of that, Emily?
So what I make of the violence is that it has set the cadence to this entire episode. It emerged in the autumn, originally relatively pacifist. Roundabouts, you saw groups of individuals. It escalated over time as the government seemed to be intransigent. It wasn't engaging with the demands of the Yellow Vests. You saw a thawing off around about Christmas. The government starting to say that they would negotiate, starting to make policy concessions. And I think here we're in a third phase where after Christmas, even with these concessions on the table, even with this organization of a national debate and the pledge to sort of engage with the demands and the grievances of a particular group, violence has continued, which has led, from what I analyzed.
I wanted to ask you about Marine Le Pen, and she's spoken about the violence as well. She's condemned it, but said that essentially the French government did this purposefully, almost as a trap, according to her, saying that this amounts to pitting yellow vests against police, pitting French against French, people who probably on both sides have the same grievances. Do you think that was, I don't know if I should use the word conspiracy, but a conspiracy possibly on the part of the government to pit French against French?
I don't imagine it was a conspiracy. That wouldn't be the Occam's razor interpretation of the situation.
Okay.
I do think it is being instrumentalized quite strategically by the government, this violence, the fact that it persists, the fact that they can pin it on a very small group of individuals and make this clear distinction between a supposedly legitimate large mass of protesters with very coherent and perhaps understandable demands, and this small group of violent, property-damaging hooligans. It helps them because, one, it means that they don't have to engage with the demands of that group, which, to be quite frank, makes their life a lot easier because the demands are not clear. It isn't very clear what that sort of violent fringes grievances are. They're general, they're vague, they have to do with a sort of general discontent with the situation. So it allows that. And second of all, it also allows them to start to bring in a sort of securitarian discourse and imagine certain policies to restrict that kind of behavior that might otherwise not be legitimate or proportionate if the protests were not violent.
Okay, so I'm going to give the final word to Alexander. Alexander, what do you make of the fact that it seems that the rest of Europe or movements in the rest of Europe are also picking up this Yellow Vest movement? We have, of course, the Italian deputy prime ministers who have encouraged the Yellow Vests, angering French officials. But we also have in the UK, for example, where you are, a left-wing People's Assembly is inviting thousands to wear yellow vests during anti-austerity march in London. And then we have right-wing Brexiteers as well, who are picking up these Yellow Vest movement as well. What do you make of the spread of the Yellow Vests across Europe?
Make of the spread, it's this kind of social anger, basically. People are, these Yellow Vest movements that are spreading in Europe are angry with their leaders because they don't trust their governments anymore concerning, for example, the rise of living costs. And so it's a kind of, I would say, populism, because in France, they're supported by Marine Le Pen's far right and Jean-Luc Mélenchon's far left. So it's a kind of populism. And here, the pro-Brexit Yellow Vest movements, and of course they're demonstrating against austerity. And in Italy, as you know, there's a populist government. So really, it's a populist movement, I would say.
Very well. We'll leave that as our final word, but of course, appreciate both of your analysis and insight as you provided on this very important topic. That was Dr. Emily St. Denis, a political expert speaking to us live from Stirling in Scotland. She's a lecturer in politics at the University of Stirling. We also had Alexander Seal, journalist from London. He's a freelance journalist and an expert in French politics as well. And earlier we had Van Mekerdurchian, who's speaking to us from Paris, and he is a political commentator. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, there are obviously a number of facets and angles that one can take when it comes to discussing the Yellow Vest protests that continue in France, now into a 9th weekend. But those protests now spreading seemingly across Europe, the Italian right-wing government even seemingly supporting this, at least some of its deputy prime ministers supporting this. The Brexiteers also in the UK picking up motivation from this, as well as other movements across Europe. We'll wait and see how all of this works out and whether this national debate initiative, which Macron has brought to the fore, will work. Seemingly right now, many Yellow Vests will not be taking part in that. But as I said, we'll keep a close eye on that for future editions of The Scope. But thanks for watching. For this edition, I've been Waqar Rizvi.